Welcome to Module 4 of our API training series. So in this topic we'll deal with the relatively complicated scenario of navigating the inputs and outputs to processes. So the way we'll cover this is we'll talk about what a genealogy is and how it's created. We'll touch upon why processes are the central sort of piece of tracking within the LIMS and how an understanding of them is key to using the API in a meaningful manner. And then we'll start to look in detail at the input-output maps that a process generates, and we'll focus on the many-to-many relationships that outputs often have to inputs and vice versa. And as always, we'll end with exercises and homework. Depending upon what you're most interested in, there's probably a few ways to define what a genealogy is. A simplified way would be to say that a genealogy is a representation or history of what has happened to a sample as it's progressed from a submitted sample through one or more workflows in the LIMS. Let's have a look at this diagram here, which also tries to explain what's happening, and hopefully this will show you the relationship between artifacts and processes. So let's start in the center of the diagram where we see artifacts, and there are various flavors or types of artifacts such as result files or analytes, where of course an analyte is just a fancy name for a sample that has been derived through workflow processing. So we draw the distinction between a submitted sample and a derived sample. Derived samples are analytes. So we can see that analytes proceeding from left to right are fed into processes as the result of lab activities. And typically a process will produce new artifacts. So we see a loop there between artifact and process. And this is typical of a workflow. Artifacts are fed into the first process, typically analytes, and that process will produce new samples, or rather analytes, and those output artifacts immediately become the input artifacts to the next process in the workflow. And so this goes on. And at the end of the workflow, if you chain all of those outputs to inputs and inputs to processes and list everything out in a chronological manner, you end up with a genealogy. So it's probably a good idea to switch over to the operations client and look at one for real. Here we are in the operations interface, and if I start examining a specific project and go to the list of the submitted samples, and if I just take the first sample here in the list and we right click and choose view, we can see its genealogy, and we'll see that there are two processes that have been run in this mini workflow. So the analyte that was associated with the submitted sample is classed as the input artifact to this first process, and that produced new artifacts or analytes which are located on a plate here. So here's the process, there's the input artifacts, there's the output artifacts, and the output artifacts were obviously used as the input artifacts to the second process, this one here. And this produced, this is a more interesting one, this produced 4 outputs, all relating to this single input. So we said that processes could produce different numbers and different types of output artifacts. Here's a good example. So the input was an analyte, the output is 1, 2, 3 result file placeholders, and a 4th result file placeholder, which, although it's not obvious to tell from this view, we'll see in a few minutes that this one, the one labeled Excalibur driver file, relates to all of the input samples and we class that as a shared result file. It should be obvious by now that the process is the central part of tracking what's happened in the limbs to individual entities or samples. And so they have obviously a great importance in terms of tracking, but they're also important for other reasons. So processes are the main event that we use to typically fire off integration to instruments. As well as tracking what went into a process and what came out of the process, we can also record customizable information on the processing that occurred. So lab type information on the experimental conditions is a usual kind of thing that's recorded there. As well, we can do some fancy things by attaching data files to the outputs of processes and parsing those in an automated fashion, and maybe digging out and recording specific information that's not hand entered but is introduced to the LIMS via a data file which is subsequently parsed. Like most other entities, we can use our web browser to interrogate the LIMS and look at the information that pertains to a particular process. So on this slide we see an example of some XML which is returned by carrying out a get at the process resource for a specific process. And if we look at the body of this XML, we see that the majority of it is made up by this section which is the input-output map. So we've got a little bit of stuff at the top. If we'd had user-defined fields, they would be defined at the end of the XML, but the bulk of this is going to be these input-output maps. And really what these do is define the correlation or the association between what went in and what went out of the process. And they do this for a single pair of inputs to outputs. So you may see multiple of these input-output maps, one for each inputs that you have. And if we look at this, we see that within the input-output map we see the node which relates to the input and the node which relates to the output. Although the input-output map as it's represented in XML contains pretty much all the information we need to figure out the connectivity between inputs and outputs, it's not intuitive, at least not at first. So if you're confused about what's happening within a process input-output map, or rather a collection of those, it might be worth opening up the LIMS and viewing what the screen that we call the Input-Output Explorer, which is displayed here. And this is an interactive screen which we can probably best illustrate by actually switching over to the operations interface and looking at this for real. Let's examine the process we'd looked at earlier, and in particular let's take a look at the Input-Output Explorer view that relates to this process. So in the operations interface I can select the process, right click and choose View, and it probably makes sense to maximize the real estate here and to open this up. So on the left hand side of the screen we see the inputs, and on the right we see the outputs. And this view is interactive in that if I click on an input, as I've done here, you'll see on the right hand side the corresponding outputs have been selected. So I can see what I was talking about in the earlier video, that this process for the single input produced 3 result files which are going to be used to store the raw data. And let's just check there isn't something else. Yes, at the bottom here we see that this sample is also associated with the shared file, which is the Excalibur driver file. For fun, let's look at sample 2. That 2 obviously is associated with the driver file. If we scroll back up, we'll see that that one is associated with just 2 sets of raw data. So that's another facet we can have. The cardinality between inputs and outputs can vary on a sample by sample basis. And the last thing I wanted to show here was this in reverse, i.e. if we select an output, in this case the shared output, we'll see that it relates to all of the samples, which makes sense because it's shared amongst them. And similarly, if we pick the result file placeholder for an individual set of raw data, we can see which sample it relates to. If you want to put what we've learned in this session into practice, one thing we can do is to complete the exercises. So as defined here, what we need to do is download a script from the developer website, which is called Viewing the Inputs and Outputs of a Process. And as noted here, this script relies upon the Groovy utility class being in the same directory, so you will need to pick up that too. And obviously you will need to edit the script for your limbs in particular. So you'll need the limbs ID of a specific process, and you'll need to give it the IP of your server and obviously the login and the password details. And we'll see running that script for real as an exercise in a separate recording.